Hello, hello, my companionate connoisseurs of Camellia sinensis. I'm glad you're here for the 7th and final episode of my introductory tea series. As a capstone, I thought it would be fun to take a little trip back through centuries and millennia to see how the whole tea obsession actually kicked off, and will also be sort of a teaser episode for the start of the next series, deep dives into tea history and culture. If you go by the legends, tea started in China with a literal leaf meets water accident in 2700 BCE, when a stray leaf blew into Emperor Shennong's boiling pot. It's a lovely story, but it's just that, a story, and modern science tells a slightly more grounded tale. We now know, thanks to mass spectrometry and some very old plant remains, that tea was a favoured beverage of the Chinese royalty at least 2,150 years ago, in around the 2nd century BCE. What's most significant about this is the tea wasn't just decaying leaf litter. It consisted of unopened tea buds that had been compressed. This concentrated, processed state indicates that the tea was not merely picked and dunked as a fresh leaf, but was a high-quality commodity prepared for longevity and trade. Essentially, a 2,000-year-old predecessor to the dark tea cakes we see in modern pu'er. The fact that such a refined product was being buried with royalty at least 2 millennia ago proves that tea was already a sophisticated, established good in the region, long before the written records of the later dynasties. Tea largely remained in China for about 600 years, give or take, until it managed to find its way east in the weathered hands of some Buddhist monks to Korea and Japan. Tea and Buddhism share a long history, and tracking the movements of both shows similar paths. But the spread of Buddhism is not entirely responsible for the spread of tea during the same period. Rather, it was the combined influence of Buddhist monks desiring to bring tea with them when they travelled to new places, and the ever-increasing use of the tea horse and silk roads for trade that inevitably transported tea across the Asian continent. In Japan, the springboard event for tea culture allegedly began when a Buddhist monk introduced tea to Emperor Saga in the year 815, and the emperor enjoyed it so much he ordered 5 plantations to be established around the capital. In the 12th century CE, a now staple of Japanese tea culture was introduced, matcha, and by the 16th century, it had been incorporated into what we now know as chanoyu, or the way of tea, the quintessential tea ceremony in Japan that's all about harmony, respect, tranquility, and whisking green powder until your wrist gives out. Meanwhile, in Korea, tea culture experienced a boom of sorts during the early Three Kingdoms period, the same time period that tea culture in Japan developed, but took somewhat more of a spiritual approach. The first recorded mention is a tale surrounding the offering of tea as a tribute to Kim Suro, the hero king of the Gunawan kingdom in the year 661 CE, and later, similar offerings were made to the spirits of Buddhist monks. This spiritualism eventually gave way to regular ritualism in the 13 and 1400s and became sort of a national pastime. Tea was being consumed so often and for so many reasons that it had its very own governing body, the tabong. This initially helped Korea become an exporter of tea, but as the culture shifted, Confucianism began to replace Buddhism as the dominant religion, and heavy taxation as a result of the 16th century version of bureaucratic red tape eventually led to a near-total stop in tea production for 400 years or so, until it was reintroduced on a large scale by Japan in the late 19th century. Of the ancient Korean tea tradition, only dari, the practice of tea etiquette, remains. While the East was busy refining tea into a high art, Europe was fashionably late to the party, only getting in on the action in the 16th century. The first mentions of chai began trickling into Italy via travelogues and trade reports, often described as a miraculous medicinal broth from the Orient that could cure everything from a headache to a heavy heart. However, it was the Portuguese who first got their boots on the ground, or rather their ships in the harbour, becoming the first Europeans to regularly drink the stuff after establishing a trade route to Guangzhou in 1516. By the early 1600s, the Dutch had smelled a profit and began commercially importing tea into Europe, where it initially sat on pharmacy shelves as a luxury health tonic for the elite. It wasn't until the mid-17th century that tea truly conquered England, largely thanks to Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess who brought her tea-drinking habit to the British royal court as part of her dowry. What started as a niche aristocratic hobby quickly spiraled into a national identity, eventually leading to the enormous trade networks and tea-related drama that would reshape global economics and, quite literally, fuel the British Empire. It was less a case of the West deciding tea was the next big thing, and more a case of tea being the perfect passenger for the global shipping explosion. Spices like pepper and nutmeg had already paved the trade routes, but once the various East India companies, those oh-so-ethical state-sanctioned monopolies from Britain, France, the Netherlands and beyond, realised that tea was in high demand, could be shipped easily and sold for a fortune, the race was on. The British East India Company, BEIC, in particular, saw a golden opportunity to move past the inconsistent spice trade and lean into a product that inspired daily cravings. They headed full sail, pun intended, into the tea trade, effectively turning a regional Oriental secret into a global commodity. This wasn't just a trend, it was a corporate-led expansion that used tea as the primary fuel for maritime commerce, eventually making it a national necessity across Western Europe. This increased demand led the BEIC into some rather questionable dealings with China. For a long time, the trade relationship was a one-way street. The British were absolutely gasping for tea, but the Chinese Qing dynasty would only accept silver bullion in exchange for the leaves. This created a massive trade deficit that was hemorrhaging silver from the British Empire. To stop the bleeding, the BEIC turned to a dark alternative. They established opium plantations in their Indian territories and smuggled the narcotics into China to force the flow of silver back into British pockets. When the Chinese government realised they were trading their tea and hard-won silver for a substance that was devastating their society, they initiated a crackdown and boycott against the foreign devils. This legal and diplomatic breakdown, often resulting in the seizure and destruction of British cargo, convinced the BEIC that relying solely on China was a supply chain nightmare, forcing them to look toward the wild tea of India as a desperate Plan B. Long before the British East India Company ever considered planting a single bush in the region, the indigenous Singpo people of northeast India and Myanmar were already the region's earliest tea consumers. Their traditional tea, known as phalop, was prepared using an ancient artisanal method where fresh leaves were pan-fired, sun-dried, and then tightly packed into hollow bamboo tubes to be smoked over a fire for at least a week. This process allowed the tea to ferment and harden into a cylindrical shape that could be preserved for years, sliced off as needed to brew a smoky, medicinal beverage. However, the British narrative shifted in the 1820s and 30s when they discovered these indigenous Assamica plants and realised they could break the Chinese trade monopoly. This discovery led to a rapid, industrial-scale expansion of British-sanctioned tea plantations, which favoured high yield over artisanal tribal methods, and left a lasting impression of tea culture in India that still exists even today. But the British East India Company's meddling didn't even end there, as their frantic attempt to save their failing monopoly eventually lit a fuse across the Atlantic in the American colonies. Due to a near-total stranglehold they had on the legal tea trade, but at outrageous prices that couldn't compete with various black markets that had started to pop up, by the 1770s, the BEIC was sitting on a staggering £17 million of tea and no way to get rid of it, leading Parliament to pass the Tea Act of 1773. This allowed the company to ship tea directly to the American colonies and sell it at a bargain price, undercutting local merchants while still collecting a Townsend duty tax. For the colonists, tea became the ultimate symbol of taxation without representation. While the Boston Tea Party, where 342 chests of tea were unceremoniously dumped into the harbour, is the most famous act of defiance. It was far from the only one. In Charleston, colonists allowed tea to rot in damp cellars rather than pay the tax, while in Annapolis, the Peggy Stewart was burned to the waterline, along with its cargo. Tea, of course. From Philadelphia to Princeton, tea became a political poison. And while the spark of the American Revolution was fueled by more than just bitter brews being thrown in harbours and bitter resentments being harboured against Britain, tea ended up being the leaf that broke the camel's back. I think that's how the saying goes anyway. Hopefully this video whetted but didn't spoil your appetite for more on tea's long, convoluted and somewhat sordid journey across the world, because there's far more to come. I hope you've enjoyed these introductory videos and would love to see you again for the next series. I appreciate you lot and will return again soon. Toodles, my beauties. Oh, and don't forget to always remember, steep, sip, stay curious.